the Upper Room. I think this is edition number 9, something like that. And it's so good to have you with us. You know, with all that's gone on this year, a crazy year by anybody's estimation with COVID and riots and things like that, there's a great chance you may have missed something very significant, and I want to draw your attention to it. Back in February, I believe it was, of this year, a lady by the name of Katherine Johnson passed away. She was 101 years old. Now, that's not significant in of itself because you probably know someone named Katherine Johnson, but not this Katherine Johnson. The life of Katherine Johnson was depicted in the movie Hidden Figures, and if you didn't see it, let me fill you in on what it is. It's the story of 3 African-American women who broke both the color barrier and the gender barrier by working for NASA. And Katherine Johnson would ride to work in Virginia with her 2 best friends, Dorothy Vaughan and Mary Jackson. And they worked there as human calculators. They actually called them computers. Now, this was before machine computers really became useful to anybody in general. But what happened is they would spend their time with pencil and paper calculating the different equations that needed to take place in order for NASA to get John Glenn into orbit. So we're in the 60s and this is going on, and these ladies made all of the difference. The movie is called Hidden Figures, of course, because of the math element, but it's also because nobody really knew about these ladies until just recently. So when she died at age 101 and her 2 friends had passed away before that, this was significant. Now there's a phrase that comes up in the movie. It also came up several times in the movie Apollo 13, and I want to land on that phrase. And the phrase that they used time and time again was this: go, no go. That's it. Go, no go. You probably can surmise what is meant by that, but the idea go, no go is really about it's time to make a decision. We either go forward or we step back and recalculate. So it was used as astronauts had to decide and engineers had to decide if it was time to launch, if it was time to enter back into the atmosphere. It was either go or it was no go. This is also used of pilots. You can see that I'm in front of a Cessna airplane, and Steve Mathis has been so kind to let us use his airplane for this little segment. There's a pilot by the name of Paul Wiley out of Arizona that writes for ArizonaPilots.org, and here's what he says about this idea. He says, arguably the most important decision a pilot routinely makes is the decision to either fly or not fly. Then he goes on to say, go or no go. And so this wasn't just about NASA, it wasn't just about astronauts and engineers, it's about pilots today. There comes that moment where a decision has to be made. We either move forward and we really get into what we've been planning for, or we step back is the idea. We are at that moment in this ministry called the Upper Room. It's go, no go time, and I'm telling you, we're going. We're going. We've done all the foundational work. These last 8 lessons have been foundational in understanding who we are, what we're about, why we do what we do, and we've even gotten into the hows, how we're going to do this. We've talked about the fact that we're going to make Jesus central to everything we do, and so we've decided studying Him, sharing Him, seeking Him are the hows, and we're going to add the 4th how, and the 4th how is going to be to serve Him. And this follows the blueprint of the original church, the people of the way, as they, in Acts 2:42, did all 4 of those things. Now you may be surprised that when it says that they were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to prayer, to fellowship, and the breaking of bread, that it's the breaking of bread that is the serving Jesus part. And you may think, man, how do you connect those dots? That's what today will be about. We will connect those dots for you, and then we'll proceed as we step into, this is the transitional lesson now, from foundational principles to stepping into the upper room, where we will live now for the next, most likely, year. So we're so glad you're with us on this journey. Let's press on. was quite a ride. I'll be honest with you, it was a bit bumpy. In fact, Steve, the guy that took us up, said he apologized for how turbulent it was. Like he was, responsible for that. But it was fun, and glad to be back on the ground. I think of a story that I love. It's about a kid named Jonathan who was 6 years old, and he was in Sunday school, and his Sunday school teacher on that given Sunday wanted to reenact creation. So she gave out parts to everybody, all parts of creation, and she happened to give little Jonathan the part of God. And so what Jonathan needed to do is climb up on a table or a chair and take a flashlight and shine it down on creation. Well, that went all right for a little bit, but then all of a sudden light was going all around the room and it got kind of chaotic. And before she knew it, the teacher had her dress tugged on, and she looked down and it was Jonathan. She'd been focused on the rest of creation, and it was classic. He just looked up and handed the flashlight back to her and said, "Can you find someone else to do this, to play God? I'm just too crazy today." Isn't that great? That is the reality of all of us, if we're honest, is that we are too crazy to play God. And yet it doesn't always stop us from playing God, does it? When I say play God, none of us would ever, try to propagate the idea that we have created what we see around us, but we do routinely try to control our own lives and others' lives as well. And this is throughout all culture, this idea of, I want to be the focus of attention. I want to be known. If you are the God of your little universe, that little universe is very small. There's only room for really one person. Our culture right now has an acronym that's being thrown about here and there, and the acronym is GOAT, and it stands for the greatest of all time, right? You have the greatest quarterback, you have the greatest basketball player, you have the greatest musician, the greatest actor, the greatest president, who knows, but that's something that we all think, man, that would be something to be called the greatest of all time. When I was a kid, there was a guy by the name of Muhammad Ali. Before he was known as Muhammad Ali, he was known as Cassius Clay, but he was famous during his heavyweight boxing title runs of several years of saying, "I am the greatest." You might remember that. He had a promoter. His boxing promoter was a guy by the name of Don King, and he had that troll hair, if you remember. And he once did a story. They did a story on him in the Los Angeles Times, and he literally said this. He says, "I never cease to amaze my own self, and I say that humbly." We are all plagued with this idea that we want to at least, if not be the God of our little universes, we want to be king, right? We want to be king. And that's why we're sitting here in front of Storm King Mountain. It's really a beautiful mountain. It's not, I don't think, part of the San Juan range, but Storm King Mountain reminds me that we try to be the king of our universes, and usually that creates a storm or two. We want to be known. Have you ever had somebody just say, "Oh, I know who you are"? You've never met them before. "I know who you are." Isn't there something inside you that just kind of swells up with pride? You do. We have a fear that people won't know us, that we're not recognizable, that we're just, we just fade into the woodwork, into the environment around us, and nobody really recognizes us. Great story about a grandma that had her little grandkids, I think a 4-year-old and a 5 or 6-year-old, staying the night with her, and she put them to bed, and then she went into her room and into her bathroom, and she changed into an old robe, and she took a shower and then changed in, and she wrapped her hair in a towel, and she took off her makeup, obviously, and all the jewelry. And then all of a sudden she heard the kids being rambunctious, so she went back into the room and said, "Kids, I'm not going to tell you again, you've got to settle down now. It's time to get settled down. Get back in bed. Okay, quiet down." As she turned to walk out and walk down the hallway, she heard the 4-year-old say, "Who was that?" That's one of our greatest fears, is that people just go, "Who are you? You're nobody." And so this idea of being grandiose comes into conflict with the idea of serving. And we're going to talk about that. We've talked about the other hows, right? And now we land on this how we're going to do life in the upper room. And serving Jesus is really at the core of all this. Again, in case you haven't been a part of our previous lessons, let me just summarize where we've been. Acts 2:42 tells us what the blueprint of the early church was, that they didn't do spectacular things. They didn't do things that we can't do. They did fairly ordinary things. They did four things. It says they were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and prayer. We've covered three of those. We've covered all of them except the breaking of bread. Devoted means it was something they did continuously. It was something of strength for them, and passion for them is what that means. So now let's talk about the breaking of bread, and what does that have to do with serving Jesus? I'm glad you asked. We're going to now connect these dots, and again I want to tell you, this is a transitional lesson from foundational preparation for this ministry of the upper room. We're stepping into the upper room today for the first time, all right? And in stepping into it, I think you'll see a connection here between the breaking of bread and serving Jesus. Now, the breaking of bread, what does that mean? Is it just a meal in general? Is it the very specific meal that probably you have in mind right here? The answer is yes. It is both of those. So we pick up the story as they step into the upper room, the night before Jesus is crucified, and I'll have you follow along with me in John chapter 13. We'll start in verse 1, and we'll just go a little ways, talk about it, go a little bit further, and then we'll get fully into it. Chapter 13, verse 1 begins this way. It was just before the Passover festival. Okay, let's stop right there. That provides our context, and probably most of you are familiar with what the Passover festival was, but again, I don't want to assume that. So let's talk about the Passover festival. You have to go back 1,300 years to what they're commemorating, and they're commemorating the freeing of the Israelites as slaves from Egypt. You might remember that there had been 9 plagues that had been doled out to the Egyptians, specifically to the Pharaoh, trying to encourage him to let God's people go. All 9 of those, as uncomfortable as it made the Pharaoh and the rest of the people, had not worked. It is the 10th plague that will work. And we see this in Exodus chapter 12. I'll start reading in verse 12 and go through verse 14. God says, "On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt, and I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate," and that's what they're doing, "for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance." Okay, specifically, the death angel would come to a house, and if that house had not slaughtered their best lamb, taken that blood, put it on the doorpost of their home, the firstborn, both of the animals and of that family, would be killed, the firstborn son. And so the out for the Israelites was make sure you get these instructions right. Slaughter your best lamb, put the blood on the door frame so the death angel will pass over, and then you will be freed. And they were freed. So that's what they're about to celebrate. It was the biggest celebration of the Jewish people. There were several during the year, but this was the biggest one. And for 1,300 years, they had not forgotten what God had done for them. Now, this meal would include a lamb, of course. And by the way, that was foreshadowing, wasn't it? All that was to foreshadow what would happen 1,300 years later. And that brings us to where we are in John chapter 13. So now that you have the context, and context is always essential, especially in God's Word, but in life in general, right? Context is really important. We take things out of context, things get a little silly, get a little crazy. So the context is there. It's the Passover meal, and I take you back to verse 1, and we read this. Jesus knew that the hour had come to leave this world and go to the Father. What I want you to hear there is go, no go. Go, no go. That's what this is. This is the moment. The hour has come. The moment has come that he has been waiting for. He can't wait to get back to the Father, finish his job, finish his task at hand, and get back to the Father. So what Jesus is experiencing right now is that go, no go moment. We know what he'll do, right? History tells us that he did not fade back. He did not step back. He did not relinquish his responsibility. Okay, so let's get back to the verse at hand. having loved his own who were in the world, meaning the disciples that his Father had given him, he loved them now to the end. I want to talk about that word end. It's really an important word. There's probably a better word in some translations. It's to the full extent, but the word actually means perfectly. Perfectly. It means completely. Completely and perfectly. So when you see the end, that's where they get the completely inserted there, but also perfectly. Perfect love. Have you noticed there's a lot of confusion about love in our culture? There's a lot of confusion. And what I love about this is we're about to have it all clarified. There was a poll taken of some adults. Some adults took a poll of some kids. They were, I think, 4 and 5-year-old kids, asking them what love was. I want to read some of their answers to you. Carrie, who is age 5, said, "Love is when a girl puts on perfume and a boy puts on shaving cologne and they go out and smell each other." All right, that's one way to look at love. Noelle, who is 7 years old actually, says, "Love is when you tell a guy you like his shirt, then he wears it every day." I know that's happened. How about Chris, age 7? "Love is when mommy sees daddy smelly and sweaty and still says he's handsomer than Robert Redford." That's awesome, isn't it? Mark, age 6. "Love is when mommy sees daddy on the toilet and she doesn't think it's gross." Now we're getting closer to love, aren't we? The winner, though, let me read the winner to you. The winner of this little contest they had was a 4-year-old, and he went to his next door neighbor who had just lost his wife. And it says the 4-year-old just climbed up on his lap, went onto his porch and just climbed up on his lap and was there for some time and then came back home. And his mother asked him, "What did you say, to our neighbor, to, Mr. Johnson or whoever he was?" And he said, "Nothing, I just helped him cry." Now we're getting closer. There's a lot of confusion about love, but Jesus is about to clear it all up. Now he showed them and he showed us what perfect love is. And you know that he'll do that now through the crucifixion. But watch what happens now. This is where we tie everything together. Verse 2 of chapter 13. "The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God." Go, no-go time. "And so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him." I like what John Ortberg says about this moment. He says, "There was no grandiosity in Jesus at all. That is one reason that people had such a hard time recognizing him." Is that true? You think, how did people not recognize the Son of God when he came to this earth? Well, probably because he didn't act like he was in charge of everybody. He didn't push people around. He didn't make them serve him. The God of the universe showed us what love is by getting on his hands and knees and serving, doing the lowliest job that was known to man at that time. The servant was supposed to be there to clean the dirty, muddy, sweaty feet of people who walked in from the desert, walked in from the wilderness. But there was no servant there that day. And I wonder if Jesus waited long enough to see if any of these other guys would take upon the role of the servant. No one did. You might remember that they didn't sit upright like this at the table like we do. They reclined at their table. Their table was, only so high. And in reclining on a pillow and eating, that meant that my feet was in this guy's face and his feet was in the next guy's face. So this idea of not having their feet cleaned was a big deal, but nobody seemed to care enough to take on the role of a servant until Jesus got up and did this. Really important. Now we go to verse 12. "When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. 'Do you understand what I have done for you?' he asked. 'You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." Okay, let's tie this together. Let's connect the dots. Jesus teaches what love is by example. And what love is, by his example, is to serve others. especially those who in reality might not be as important as you, at least in your mind, in my mind. Serve others. What's the context? The context is the breaking of bread. It is within that meal, and this is what the apostles did not forget when they taught the early church. It was within that meal, it was within the Passover, it was within the breaking of bread that they learned about love and they learned about servanthood. Certainly this meal, as Jesus, as you know, will use this Passover meal to say the Passover became part of an old agreement, the old covenant. This is a part of a new agreement, what I'm about to tell you what to do. So the breaking of bread was, yes, it was a general meal, and it was also very specifically communion, what we call communion or the Lord's Supper. It's that context where Jesus says, serve. Serve, as I've served you, you have to serve one another. So Jesus says, at the end of that little monologue, he says, and you'll be blessed if you do this. The word blessed is a really important word. We see it in the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. It means, how fortunate will you be when you figure this out? How lucky are you to figure this concept out? And so the question is, have we figured it out? Have we figured out what serving one another means? Is it connected? Is it possible that we are connected by serving one another to Christ? G.K. Chesterton put it this way: the church is the one thing that saves a man from degrading servitude of being a child of his time. Meaning, to be a person or a child of our time, of our culture, means I demand to be king. I demand to be served. He says the church must come along now and teach us how to live differently. Christy and I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I actually grew up here, as you know, but then we moved to the Pacific Northwest when I was in high school. Christy lived there her whole life. It was not uncommon to see entire hillsides that looked scarred because they had logged the hillsides. Now, they years ago learned how to replant, and it reflourishes and looks beautiful again. But for a period of time, for a few years, those hillsides are just ugly. They're just ugly, and you just look at them and just kind of cringe, because where did the beautiful evergreens go? One author tells about seeing one of these hillsides that was scarred by logging, but in the middle of it was one evergreen tree that had survived. Somehow the loggers missed it. And he said, in my mind, what I saw was something that was beautifully defiant. That's what I want you to hold on to, that phrase. Beautifully defiant is what you and I are called to as his church. We're called to stand out in a scarred culture that it's just ugly, isn't it? In the midst of that, we are called to be beautifully defiant. We stand up and we don't demand to be served. We don't demand to be the center of attention, but instead we learn to serve others. And people will notice, just like we would notice if there was one evergreen tree on a scarred hillside. So he calls us to serve him. He calls us to serve one another. Which is it? Which is it? The answer is both. It is both. Years ago, a guy from Stanford wrote a collection of books. One of them talked about excellent companies and organizations, and he introduced principles that they live by. And one of those principles was called the genius of the and. He said these organizations that just supersede all other organizations around them have several things in common. One of them is that they don't look at life as it's either this or it's this or this. He says they find a way to say, could it be both? And I'm telling you that today, that serving Jesus is serving others. Serving others is serving Jesus. And so, we come back to the blueprint that we've been talking about, and this is kind of the ending of this foundational information, foundational instruction about the upper room. They studied Jesus. They shared Jesus. They sought Jesus. And the breaking of bread reminded them to serve Jesus. And in serving Jesus, they served one another. I'm guessing you've heard of C.S. Lewis, very famous author. His a trivia question for you. You can even pause the video if you want to try to work on it. What does the CS stand for? And you can't use your phones. You can't Google this. Okay? You can't even ask Siri. What did CS stand for? Did you get it? Anybody get it? CS stood for Clive's Staple. Clive Staple. What a name. I would have chosen CS as well. I want to tell you a little bit about C.S. Lewis that you might not know. He fought in World War I, and he actually had a relationship with a friend his name was Patty, and they had an agreement that if either of them died, the other one would go home and take care of the other one's family, and specifically his mother. And his buddy did die, and he went home and from that point on introduced that guy's mother as his own mother. Interesting. That's a little foreshadowing for something we're going to end with here in a minute. But I wanted to go back to C.S. Lewis after World War I, at the beginning of World War II, and in the midst of it, he lived on the outskirts. He lived in Oxford, where he served as a professor, and he and his brother lived there in a fairly large house. And there were many children who were fleeing the cities, fleeing London and other cities that were being bombed by Germany. And these kids were becoming homeless. And so he and his brother decided to make a difference. And they accepted some of these kids, several of these kids, into their own home to take care of them. And in doing so, you had to understand, as an author, and that's how he made his living, as an author and as a professor, he needed quiet to write. He needed focus. And he gave that up. He really did. But he sacrificed what was most important to him, his place and time to focus in writing and teaching, by inviting numbers of children into his home. And if you've been around numbers of children, especially who aren't yours, you realize there's not much peace and quiet to be had. But he was willing to do that. It was interesting that it was during that time that some of these kids found a wardrobe in his house and began playing in and around the wardrobe. And he watched them, and he came up with an idea. I bet you're ahead of me. He began writing a children's story. He had always written deep theological writings. He had come out of atheism and given his life to Christ, and he wrote books like Mere Christianity and others. But all of a sudden, he felt prompted by seeing these children playing in and out around that wardrobe to write a book. And the book was called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which spawned a series called The Chronicles of Narnia. That was in 1950. I have to tell you that that series alone, that series of books, The Chronicles of Narnia, have sold 90 million copies, and they are in 30 different languages around the world. All because C.S. Lewis was willing to sacrifice, to serve people that could never pay him back, right? Here's what he says: give up yourself and you'll find your real self. Lose your life and you'll save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of the whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep nothing back. Do those words sound familiar to you? Those are basically a paraphrase of what Jesus said when he said, the man who seeks to save his life will lose it, and he who's willing to lose his life will save it for my kingdom. And so that applies to this idea of serving Jesus. Now, it wasn't long ago I heard a Bible teacher, I think we were listening to a podcast, and I use that term lightly, Bible teacher, and he was advocating the idea, and he was trying to, I think, tickle the ears of his audience. He was advocating the idea of, you don't have to serve God. You don't have to serve God. That's not required of you. Now, when I heard that, I thought, wow, I think he's kind of ignoring a few passages. Let's go back to John chapter 13, verse 14. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. How do you ignore that? That is a mandate to serve one another. I take in Mark chapter 10, verse 42, Jesus called them together, his disciples, and he said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. They love to be king. They love to be storm king, is what they love. They love to lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. We have some of those in our culture today, don't we? Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man, speaking of himself in the third person, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. By all means, he says, I'm here to show you what I've called you to do, to serve me by serving one another. Now, if there's any inkling in you, any smallest part of you that still doubts whether serving one another is that important, even though I just read the very words of Jesus, I want to challenge you one more time with it before we close. And I want to do it by offering you the opportunity to do a pop quiz. So real quick, take a break, and I have a question for you. Talk amongst yourselves, and we'll come back and we'll get into the last part of this. What did Jesus predict that came true? Can you answer that? Can you talk amongst yourselves and answer, what did Jesus say is happening or will happen in a prophetic way that came true? I hope you came up with some examples. There's plenty. Amongst them, and your leader can lead you through this, but amongst them are his own crucifixion and resurrection. He certainly predicted that. The fall of Jerusalem, the Samaritan woman, who he said, I know about you. I know that you're living with a man that's not your husband, and you've lived with 5 other husbands. That was him saying, I know things that the typical person does not know. Peter denying him, he predicted that. Judas betraying him, and then there's this prediction that will come true. I take it to Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you who are blessed of my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when? When did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? That's a legitimate question, right? I mean, most of us don't realize when that would have happened. The king will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Now he turns to the goats and he says the same thing. I was experiencing all those things that I just told you, and you did not feed me. You did not give me something to drink. You did not clothe me. You did not visit me. And they will also answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? Listen to his reply, verse 45. He will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. That is a prophecy of Jesus. That will happen. We can no longer deny the connection between serving others, especially those we think don't deserve it, and serving Christ. They are one and the same. It's the genius of the and. Okay, earlier I told you about C.S. Lewis and the arrangement he had with his friend Patty, who died in World War I. And World War I has a lot of stories like that. There's an often told story about 2 guys that didn't even know each other before the war, but became fast friends and good buddies as they were in the trenches. Now, the trench warfare is what World War I is famous for, and it was brutal. Not that any war is not brutal, but that trench warfare was just unbelievable. And the story is told that these 2 had said, well, I'll be by your side no matter what. Well, they got the call to charge. They jumped out of their trench. They went out, and it was a bloody fight, and they got separated. He was called back. They were called back into the trenches by their commanding officers. And when he got back there, he looked around for his buddy, and he was nowhere to be found. He jumped up to go back into the war, back into the battle, and his commanding officer said, Where are you going? He said, I'm going back to get my buddy. He says, No, you're not. You can't go back in there. He says, I've already lost enough men in this battle. You stay where you are. And he turned around and walked away, and the guy still, he knew he needed to do this. He jumped out of his trench, and it was brutal. Shells going off over his head, smoke choking him, having his face buried in the muddy, bloody ground that he was crawling on. But eventually he found his way to his buddy. And when he got there, they talked a little bit, and then he began, and he was, wounded very badly. He began to drag him, and he drug him several feet, several yards, and then got him back into the trench. But by the time he got him back into the trench, he had died. His commanding officer had watched this, and now was just angry as everything with him. And he said, well, was it worth it? Was it worth risking your life for just a corpse? And the man looked at him and said, it was very much worth it. He says, how in the world can you tell me it was worth it when you risked your life like that and you didn't need to? He said, it was worth it because of what he said to me when I got there. He said, well, what did he say that would make that worth it? He looked at his commanding officer and he looked at me and said, I knew you'd come. I knew you'd come. It is that heart that we are called to. We are now stepping into the upper room, which I think will be there for some time together now. And it is in this room that we'll learn about what communities who truly want to follow Jesus look like, what happens in those communities. And I think you'll find it really interesting. But the bottom line here is that we're at go, no go. And again, I want to tell you, as a ministry, we're going. We're going. We're going forward. Jesus came to this go, no go moment. The hour had come, it says. We know what he did. We as a ministry have come to this go, no go moment. We've done preparation. We've done foundational things. Do we launch now? Do we go forward? I'm telling you we do. How about you? The call is there to make Jesus the focus of your life, to study him in community, to share him in community, to seek him in community, and now to serve him in community by serving one another. And now you and I have a decision individually to make. We do answer to the community because we're going to do this as a family, as a group of people who are devoted to following Jesus. But you individually now are at go, no go. Will you go forward with this, or will you be tempted to shrink back and say, taking care of number one is really what I've always done and it's what feels most comfortable to me? That becomes the question now. My prayer is that you will just launch with us, jump all in, and we will learn together what it means to do life with Jesus, with his people.